Section 19 of Gray's Anatomy. Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4 by Henry Gray. Composition and Connections of Cranial Nerves, Part 1. 4e. Composition and Central Connections of the Spinal Nerves. The cranial nerves are more varied in their composition than the spinal nerves. Some, for example, contain somatic motor fibers only, others contain the various types of fibers found in the spinal nerves, namely, somatic motor, sympathetic efferent, somatic sensory, and sympathetic sensory. In addition, there are included the nerves of the special senses, namely, the nerves of smell, sight, hearing, equilibration, and taste. The hypoglossal nerve, 12th cranial, consists of somatic motor fibers only and supplies the muscles of the tongue. Its axons arise from cells in the hypoglossal nucleus and pass forward between the white reticular formation and the grey reticular formation to emerge from the anterolateral sulcus of the medulla. The hypoglossal nuclei of the two sides are connected by many commissural fibers and also by dendrites of motor cells which extend across the midline to the opposite nucleus. The hypoglossal nucleus receives either directly or indirectly numerous collaterals and terminals from the opposite pyramidal tract, corticobulbar or cerebrobulbar fibers, which convey voluntary motor impulses from the cerebral cortex. Many reflex collaterals enter the nucleus from the secondary sensory paths of the trigeminal and vagus, and probably also from the nervus intermedius and the glossopharyngeal. Collaterals from the posterior longitudinal bundle and the ventral longitudinal bundle are said to pass to the nucleus. The accessory nerve, 11th cranial, contains somatic motor fibers. The spinal part arises from lateral cell groups in the anterior column near its dorsolateral margin in the upper 5 or 6 segments of the cord. Its roots pass through the lateral funiculus to the lateral surface of the cord. It supplies the trapezius and sternocleidomastoideus. The cranial part arises from the nucleus ambiguus, the continuation in the medulla oblongata of the lateral cell groups of the anterior column of the spinal cord from which the spinal part has origin. The upper part of the nucleus ambiguus gives motor fibers to the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves. The cranial part sends its fibers through the vagus to the laryngeal nerves to supply the muscles of the larynx. The root fibers of the cranial part of the accessory nerve pass anterior to the spinal tract of the trigeminal, while those of the vagus pass through or dorsal to the trigeminal root, and emerge in the line of the posterolateral sulcus. The nucleus of origin of the spinal part undoubtedly receives either directly or indirectly terminals and collaterals controlling voluntary movements from the pyramidal tracts. It is probable that terminals and collaterals reach the nucleus either directly or indirectly from the rubrospinal and vestibulospinal tracts. It is also connected indirectly with the spinal somatic sensory nerves by association fibers of the proper fasciculi. The cranial part receives indirectly or directly terminals and collaterals from the opposite pyramidal tract, and form the terminal sensory nuclei of the cranial nerves. A few fibers of the cranial part are said to arise in the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, and are thus sympathetic efferent. They are said to join the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, 10th cranial, contains somatic sensory, sympathetic afferent, somatic motor, sympathetic efferent, and taste fibers. The afferent fibers, somatic sensory, sympathetic, and taste, have their cells of origin in the jugular ganglion and in the nodosal ganglion, ganglion of the trunk, and entering the medulla divide into ascending and descending branches as do the sensory fibers of the posterior roots of the spinal nerves after they enter the spinal cord. 1. The somatic sensory fibers are few in number, convey impulses from a limited area of the skin on the back of the ear and posterior part of the external auditory meatus, and probably join the spinal tract with the trigeminal nerve to terminate in its nucleus. Connections are probably established to the central path of the trigeminal with the thalamus and somatic sensory area of the cortex for the conscious recognition of impulses. The descending fibers in the spinal tract of the trigeminal, terminating in the nucleus of the tract, probably establish relations through connecting neurons with motor nuclei in the anterior column of the spinal cord and with motor nuclei of the medulla. 2. The sympathetic afferent fibers are usually described as terminating in the dorsal nucleus of the vagus and glossopharyngeal. Some authors, however, believe they join the tractus solitarius and terminate in its nucleus. These afferent fibers convey impulses from the heart, the pancreas, and probably from the stomach, esophagus, and respiratory tract. Their terminals in the dorsal nucleus come into relation with neurons whose axons probably descend into the spinal cord, conveying impulses to the motor nuclei supplying fibers to the muscles of respiration, i.e. the phrenic nerve and the nerves to the intercostal and levatorius costarum muscles. Other axons probably convey vasomotor impulses to certain sympathetic efferent neurons throughout the spinal cord. The dorsal nucleus of the ala cinerea, and the posterior continuation of it into the commissural nucleus of the ala cinerea constitute probably the so-called respiratory and vasomotor center of the medulla. The shorter reflex neurons of the dorsal nucleus probably effect connections, either directly or indirectly, with motor cells of the vagus itself and other cranial nerves. 3. Taste fibers conducting impulses from the epiglottis and larynx are supposed to pass in the vagus and join the tractus solitarius, finally terminating in the nucleus of the tractus solitarius. It is not certain that this nucleus represents the primary terminal center for taste, and some authors maintain that the taste fibers terminate in the dorsal nucleus. The secondary ascending pathways from the primary gustatory nucleus to the cortex, as well as the location of the cortical center for taste, are unknown. A gustatory center has been described near the anterior end of the temporal lobe. The nucleus of the tractus solitarius is connected with motor centers of the pons, medulla, and spinal cord for the reactions of mastication and swallowing. 4. Somatic motor fibers to the cross-striated muscles of the pharynx and larynx arise in the nucleus ambiguus. This nucleus undoubtedly receives either directly or indirectly collaterals or terminals from the opposite pyramidal tract controlling the voluntary movements of the pharynx and larynx. The reflex pathways conveying impulses from the terminal sensory nuclei are unknown, but probably form part of the intricate maze of fibers constituting the reticular formation. 5. Sympathetic efferent fibers arise from cells in the dorsal nucleus of the ala cinerea. These are preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic system, and all terminate in sympathetic ganglia from which postganglionic fibers are distributed to various organs, i.e. motor fibers to the esophagus, stomach and small intestine, gallbladder, and to the lungs, inhibitory fibers to the heart, secretory fibers to the stomach and pancreas. The dorsal nucleus not only receives terminals of sympathetic afferent fibers for reflexes, but undoubtedly receives terminals and collaterals from many other sources, but the exact pathways are at present unknown. The glossopharyngeal nerve, 9th cranial, is similar to the vagus nerve as regards its central connections, and is usually described with it. It contains somatic sensory, sympathetic afferent, taste, somatic motor, and sympathetic efferent fibers. The afferent sensory fibers arise from cells in the superior ganglion and in the petrosal ganglion. The same uncertainty exists concerning the nuclei of termination and nuclei of origin of the various components as for the vagus. 1. The somatic sensory fibers are few in number. Some are distributed with the auricular branch of the vagus to the external ear, others probably pass to the pharynx and fauces. They are supposed to join the spinal tract of the trigeminal and terminate in its nucleus. The connections are similar to those of the somatic sensory fibers of the vagus. 2. Sympathetic afferent fibers from the pharynx and middle ear are supposed to terminate in the dorsal nucleus. Connections are probably established with motor nuclei concerned in chewing and swallowing. Very little is known, however, about the connections with other parts of the brain. 3. Taste fibers from the tongue probably terminate in the nucleus of the tractus solitarius. These fibers, together with similar fibers from the facial, nervus intermedius, and the vagus, are supposed to form the tractus solitarius and terminate in its nucleus. The central connections have been considered under the vagus. 4. Somatic motor fibres to the silopharyngeus muscle arise in the upper end of the nucleus ambiguus. The existence of these fibres in the roots of the glossopharyngeal is uncertain, as there are other paths by which such fibres might reach in the glossopharyngeal from the vagus. The sources of impulses passing to the nucleus ambiguus are considered under the vagus. 5. Sympathetic efferent fibres, motor and secretory fibres, arise from the nucleus dorsalis. Some authors believe that the secretory fibres to the parotid gland arise from a distinct nucleus, the inferior salivatory nucleus, situated near the dorsal nucleus. The preganglionic fibres from this nucleus terminate in the otic ganglion. The postganglionic fibres from the otic ganglion pass to the parotid gland. The acoustic nerve, 8th cranial, consists of two distinct nerves, the cochlear nerve, the nerve of hearing, and the vestibular nerve, the nerve of equilibration. End of Part 19.